All right, so on to chapter 2. I tried to write it up here in advance so that way, we can cover it a little more quickly. Chapter 2 deals largely with ethical and legal considerations. What are your ethical obligations? What are your legal considerations? Sort of add the word ethics there too. Because ethics and legal are two different things, right? Something could be technically not wrong, but unethical, right? You might not get into legal issues if you lie to somebody, but it could be unethical if you lie to somebody, right? And under certain circumstances. Let's take a look at some examples. So, obligations to your employer. Some of the obligations as a technical communicator or as an employee in general, if say you're an engineer that's designing something for a company, you have certain obligations to your employer. Competence. You need to make sure that you know your field and you're doing your best to deliver on your assigned duties, right? If you're given a paycheck, chances are you have to do something. For instance, I have an ethical obligation to my employer to stay up to date on the field, right? I need to research the field of technical communications. I need to present on topics. I need to be engaged in the field. I need to do some consulting maybe. And by doing that, I stay up to date on the field so I can deliver good content to you, right? So my obligations to my employer is to be a competent instructor, to know my field. Generosity is something that you don't usually think about from an employer's standpoint, or from an employee's standpoint, I should say. But generally speaking, this comes into deal with time a lot of times. A lot of us have jobs, or a lot of people want to have jobs where they can say, 9 to 5, and after 5 I check out and I don't have to check back in until 9 o'clock on Monday morning. That's not the way it works, all right? In many professional fields, you are kind of on call all the time. In my field, as a professor, I have to be very generous with my time, right? So sometimes I'm working 65 to 70 hours a week because I have 100 students that have different needs at different times, right? If you need to, meet with me and talk with me during my office hours, I can't just say, my office hours are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and if you can't make it from 1:30 to 4 on Mondays and Wednesdays, too bad, so sad. It's not the way it works. If you contact me and you say, I can't make it on Mondays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, but I could make it at like 3 o'clock on a Tuesday, it's my ethical obligation to you as your instructor, as an employee of this university, to become available if at all possible, right? So if I'm not teaching, if I don't have any other professional conflicts at that time, it is my duty, it is my obligation to you, to the employer, to make my time available to you, right? So I need to make sure that I'm giving you the time and attention you need. I need to make sure I'm giving the university the time and attention, the time investment to make sure that we're successful at our, goals. That's what generosity mainly means. It's not about shelling out money for your organization. It's more about dedicating yourself to the time that you can, right, to achieve your goals. Honesty and candor. Well, let's think about it as a role of a communicator. The role of a communicator is to troubleshoot, to fix problems, right? That's what you're creating your communication text for. You're creating a technical text, usually to solve a problem. It doesn't help if you lie about it, right? Toyota learned that a few years ago. Back in 2008, 2009, they had that braking and accelerating issue where cars were randomly accelerating into brick walls and people couldn't brake. We had a Toyota at the time, so we were on the receiving end of that information. Sometimes they weren't as upfront and forthright about what they knew when they knew it, right? The first couple of times it comes through and they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry to hear that this happened. But it's an isolated incident. And then another car crashes, and then another one, and then they're like, all right, it happens. It's happening, yeah. Honesty and candor is being upfront. Is if somebody says, I have a problem, it's like, oh yeah, well, I have heard this problem before. Don't worry, we can get it figured out, right? That's an honest approach. Candor is like, yeah, we've had this similar issue before a couple of other times, a couple of other places, and so we have some systems in place. That would be a way of honestly acknowledging the issue and then working in a trustworthy way to fix it. That's what honesty and candor is all about. Communicating, being honest about what you know when you know it, and working with them in that honest way to fix the problem. Confidentiality is one of those things that you have an obligation to your employer while you're getting paid, while you're on the clock. If you have access to privileged information, you shouldn't be giving that privileged information to anyone outside of the company who shouldn't have it. The reason why I bring this up, Snowden. A few years ago, this guy named Snowden was working for, I think, the federal government, maybe the CIA in some way. Anyway, he had access to confidential videos. Yeah, not just confidential, classified videos, right? Classified videos of soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan. And what did he do? He saw a couple of units that appeared to attack unarmed civilians, and then he's like, whoa, this is an issue, big problem here. He was trying to do something that was for the greater good by trying to say, you know, we shouldn't do this stuff. We are better than this as a country. But what he failed to consider is his legal and ethical obligations to his employer. He was hired to handle classified information. That classified information is highly confidential and should not go to anybody that doesn't have adequate clearance. And so when he did that, he violated the ethics of his own employer and violated some legal statutes along the way. And that's why he's hanging out in Russia right now to avoid prosecution here in the United States, because he did technically do something that was, although he was thinking for the common good, was something unethical, something against the ethics of his company and his organization and his career. He did something that was unethical, and because it was classified, it was highly illegal to share that information. So think Snowden whenever you think confidentiality, and you want to make sure that if you have privileged information, you're not sharing that unnecessarily, okay? You might not be doing something illegal if you share that, but you will be doing something unethical in some cases, okay? The loyalty issue. If you're getting a paycheck from that organization, you have a certain obligation, right? You cannot accept a paycheck if you're not doing the job. That's just unethical. So while you're doing it, you want to make sure that you don't have a conflict of interest, all right? We hear that a lot these days. Okay. Now, the conflict of interest that I can come in, there's a lot of them that come to mind over the years. Say you're working for a company and you own stock in another company, right? So one of my friends in the UK actually was working for a company that went bankrupt, right? The company ended up dissolving and went out of business. Why did it go out of business? Well, some of their sales folks were working for the competitor too. So they had two jobs. They had a job doing sales with this computer software, and they had the direct competitor, and they were doing sales for them as well. Well, the competitor paid a slightly higher royalty or a slightly higher commission to what they were doing. So what they did was they're like, you could do this, but this other company has software that does the same thing. It's just as good, just as secure. You might want to go with that one. And so he would sell them and direct them to that other company so that he would get a higher royalty. Either way, he would get a royalty, regardless of who, or a commission, regardless of what he was selling, regardless which one he sold. He'd get a royalty, but or a commission. He would get a higher commission though with the competitor. So he would make choices like that. There was an issue with the MMR vaccine, right? The anti-vaxxing movement was started by Andrew Wakefield. Okay. Andrew Wakefield conducted a series of tests and tried to connect the MMR vaccine to an increased rate of autism among children in the UK. Well, what he didn't disclose was that he was on the board of some kind of organization that was creating a competitor vaccine, right? Essentially a 3-shot series instead of a 1 shot with a 3 MMR, measles, mumps, rubella. The MMR has those 3 vaccines together. It's 1 shot. This other organization that he was working with had a 3-shot sequence where you gave them each individually, right? If the MMR vaccine was discredited, his 3-shot sequence would go into the market and would sell more, and he would get a tidy sum of money out of that, right? So he had a conflict of interest when he was conducting that study, undermined his credibility while he was producing those findings. He was later on disbarred, or his doctor status had been revoked by the medical system over in the UK. So he is no longer allowed to practice medicine because the things he was doing was highly unethical. And so so there's those things. And then he starts the modern anti-vaxxing movement that we're still dealing with the fallout of today. So Andrew Wakefield, he was conducting research for something, had a conflict of interest. That's where that loyalty thing kind of comes into play a little bit. So Those are your ethical and legal obligations to the employer. When you're thinking about the public, there's really only one ethical obligation that you have to the public, and that's to make sure, well, two if you consider safe and effective. You need to make sure that the products that you're putting out are safe, and you want to make sure that whatever you say they do, right? So it's essentially just being honest with the public. So if you're developing a new braking system for the new Toyota Corolla, right? You're an engineer, you're developing that new braking system, you have an obligation to the public, regardless of what your employer says, to be releasing a safe product. Safety is a concern, making sure the brakes do what they're supposed to do. That's safety and efficacy, I guess. That's your obligation to the public. When you think about to the environment, stewardship, making sure that you are not wasting resources, right? That's something that we all have. We all have this obligation to be good stewards of the land and the resources that are around us. That's why companies like 3M have those huge sustainability movements right now, is because they want to show that they are doing what they can to be good stewards of the land. Yes, they're producing materials, and yes, they're producing chemicals, and yes, they're creating products that are going to be used widely by mankind, but they're doing their best to minimize their impact on the environment in some way. Okay, so that's your environmental obligation as a writer too. When you think about it, am I wasting a lot of paper? Can I go paperless? If I'm creating these documents, can these documents stay as a PDF, and can I release these PDFs as opposed to printing them and inserting the printed materials into the products that we're sending out? That's an environmental concern that you can think about while you're thinking about this environmental obligation towards stewardship. And then finally, the last thing, legal considerations, contract law, warranties, liability. This is stuff that you need to make sure that you're communicating outright. You need to make sure that when you are writing something, if you're writing the instructions for like a Kohler product, for example, you need to make sure that people know what the warranties are, because there is an understood, if this doesn't work, I can return it and get my money back or get it replaced. That's the purpose of a warranty. And those warranty terms need to be clearly articulated. Liability. If it breaks, if it does not do what it's supposed to do and somebody gets hurt, what are the liabilities that your company will accept, right? And why? That's pretty important, that when you're creating a contract or when you're releasing a product to the public, that's where you're maintaining this obligation to the public, making sure your product's safe and effective. Warranties and liabilities. The trademark, making sure that you're not infringing on other people's intellectual property. So if I'm creating a new cookie and it has 2 chocolate wafers and it's filled with a bunch of cream in the middle and I call it the Oreo, I am violating trademark. They've registered the name Oreo with that company. That's why you cannot call knockoff Oreos, right? They are chocolate cream cookies or something like that. If you think about it, it's like saltines. You can call many different kinds of crackers saltines. It's not a specific registered trademark. I can go and I can get an oyster cracker that's a saltine. I can go to get this knockoff brand that says saltine. It's not a registered trademark, so I can call it that thing. However, if it's a registered trademark, you need to be aware of that so that when you're writing your documents, you don't infringe on that trademark. All right, that could get you into some legal problems. The same thing goes with copyright. Copyright is the #1 issue that we're going to run into in this class. When you start to create those multimodal texts, which you're going to do later on, you're going to create texts that have images and text. You want to make sure that the text is text that you have written. You want to make sure that the images that you're using are not copyrighted images, that they're either open source stock images, or you're going to create your own images. The reason being, you don't want to violate this copyright law because that's the #1 area that you're going to get hit for in this class. That would be considered plagiarism. Okay, so that's where the intellectual property kind of law impacts and transects with this classroom. When you're creating things for this class, I want you to always think about that copyright. The copyright is, are you using something that is arguably the property of somebody else, right? If another photographer, a professional photographer, takes an image and they post it on their website, that means that it is copyrighted. You don't necessarily have the right to use that image unless you have express written permission from that person. If you are not that artist, if you are not in contact with that artist, you do not have a right to include that image in any of your work. Okay? So, create your own images, create your own text. When in doubt, that's what you need to do for this class. So that's the legal and ethical considerations from Chapter 2. And the last, and hopefully the shortest video, deals with how does all this stuff apply to our course project. So that'll be our third video, our last video of the week, and hopefully that will put you in a good place moving forward. I'll see you online.